Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest segment of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and today, on this, the anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, we have something slightly different planned for you, our devoted followers and audience members. What we have in this episode is a special HBO documentary entitled He Has Seen War. This was a special documentary that was included in a joint commemorative package that included both HBO's Band of Brothers and The Pacific. And it is a documentary that reflects on a lot of themes that those two dramatic series in many ways only briefly touch on. And these themes have to do with adjustment, acclimation back into the civilian world. How did individuals cope with the likes of post-traumatic stress and so many other more consequential issues that veterans of many wars have had to confront? Shortly after we originally posted this documentary, it was limited in its audience reach due to some of the violent imagery that was originally included in that documentary. Thus, what we have done in some instances is that we have edited out or blurred some of the more graphic archival footage that aired in the original, and thereby made it slightly tamer so the YouTube gods don't come after us and try to pull down the video once again. It was certainly not our intention to diminish or sensitize the level of trauma that was depicted in He Has Seen War. Quite the contrary. And this is why we are trying again to show this film, because it certainly conveys a lot of messages that are worthy of our consideration even many decades after the Second World War has come to an end. It is a film that needs to be watched. It is a film that needs to be watched of people of every generation, because the stories and the struggles that we hear about from the voices shown are really universal in their scope. And this is why we are re-airing He Has Seen War, demonetized. We are not making a penny off of this film being shown here on our channel. We want it to be used for educational purposes, and we want it to reach as wide an audience as possible. So with all of that being said, here is HBO's He Has Seen War.
Over 10 million men are in the armed forces. Bringing them back into civilian life would present a difficult problem, even if they had only been away overnight. It would be an even greater problem if all those more than 10 million had been away for 3 years on a holiday. What then are the dimensions of the problem when over 10 million have been in war? This is real. And after months and years of war, battle or drudgery, no matter where, there is always that bewildering letdown. The big thing has been done, whether squeezing a trigger, or guarding an island, or carrying a stretcher. And suddenly there is no more war. Here is your man. Remember, he isn't naive anymore. He's been places. He's seen things. He has seen and experienced things which should not happen under God, which should not happen under the sun, which should not happen again. Not to his children, not to his friends, not to anyone. He has been toughened to withstand these things. He is no longer illusioned. He is no longer a boy. He has seen war.
You cannot describe war. It's horrible. You cannot even think about it. unless you were there. If you were there, you know what I'm talking about. You weren't there, you know what I'm talking about. Undescribable.
There's certain amounts of stuff that dredges up some pretty bitter feelings that you have, and times when you were terrified at what was going on, and how badly it affected you.
It was a sigh of relief. It really was. It was a sigh of relief. That was my third battle, and I was just, I was beat, to tell you the truth. I was beat, and I just thought to myself, well, it's over. I'll be going home sooner or later. I don't know when, but I'll be going home sooner or later.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
I can remember that day very well, waking up and listening to the Armed Forces radio when they dropped the nuclear bomb. And I knew that was the end of the war, you know, and that was quite a day.
I was in a bar in Paris when the war ended. I remember some guy from California grabbed me, some soldier. So he started jitterbugging dancing, and I'm no dancer. But he had me try to dance with him in a goddamn bar, and I must have looked terrible.
The war ended faster, much faster than people expected. They thought they had this thing all scoped out, and they expected about an 18-month interlude between victory in Europe and the end of the war with Japan. But it happened suddenly, and when it happens, there's 12.1 million servicemen still active. We don't even have the shipping to bring them home.
The discharge of GIs under the point system begins. Length of service, combat decorations, and dependents count in the granting of discharges.
The backlog of troops going home was way, way, way back with me, frankly, at the end of it, because they'd waited so long before they authorized me to go home.
Enter the wives who want their men home. Tremendous pressure on Congress. Newspapers jumping on this. I thought the war was over.
He said, I'm out. And they said, oh, you can't do it that way. And he said, check my numbers. And he had spent 3 years in the Pacific. He was in 5 combat things, and he had more than enough numbers to have gotten out quite a while ago.
You're sitting there in Holland or Great Britain, and your number's up, and where's the ship? Well, we're picking everybody up all over the world. We're the only country to fight this war, air, sea, ground, and globally. So we got to pick all the boys up, and that takes a long time.
I came home on the USS Navaka, which was a real tub, and about 6 or 8 days out, we got into one of those typhoons. And I had just laid down and closed my eyes, and all hell broke loose. Those beams, steel beams overhead, We was putting our saving care, our best kits, our canteen cups and all that up there to get it out of the way. All of that was falling off and hitting that steel deck. The kitchen had broke loose and the stoves was going from one side to the other and banging up against it, and then it'd go back to the other side and bang. Oh, man, it was noisy. And I thought to myself, my God, here I've gone through 3 battles, been over here for over 2 years. Now I'm going to drown going home. And that's the first thing coming to my mind.
My husband was a Navy pilot, and Harvey did not get out of the war until 46. They kept the whole squadron there because they had to get all the wounded back to the United States.
The ones that were serious, we were serious, not dying, but serious wounded, get you back as quick as they could. They flew you back. So I wound up getting back by airplane quick. Where did the engine start? What the hell? And you're laying there. I said to the nurse, get me the hell out of here. Open that goddamn door. I'm going to jump out. If you don't go out, I'm going to take you with me. No, the plane landed. But one engine, though. Well, enough to scare the hell out of you. When all you went through, you're going to wind up in the ocean.
We had an idea when he would land on the West Coast, and Daddy figured out how long it would take him to get from the West Coast to Mobile. So at a certain date, my brother John and Dad and I met every train that came into Mobile from the West Coast. And he would never be on it. Mother, we'd come home and Mother say, you don't have him. And Daddy'd say, no, he wasn't on that train, Kate. So one night we were sitting eating supper and the phone rang, and Daddy answered it, and he came away from the phone. He says, he's here, Sid's here. So everybody just jumped up from the table. I don't know if we even closed the front door.
I was just so amazed that I was at home. You had dreamed about getting back to Mobile, but I couldn't actually believe it was happening. I felt like I was going to wake up and find myself back on Pavuvu for a long time.
Oh, Mom loved it. I'm glad to just get home alive. They were worried about me. When I got back, I assured them I was fine. I was fine. Just to be home was lucky, damn lucky.
She cried and cried. Cried some more. Didn't want to turn me loose. Just held on. Of course, you know, my brother had been killed in France, and she was mourning his death as well.
They're wild to see me, you know. They thought, you know, that I probably should have been killed many times, but Irish luck or God saved my life, period.
All the neighbors started coming in to visit that evening. And Sid and I were standing in the living room, and he was trying to talk to all of them. And he got me over to one side. He said, Cap, will you go with me up to the drugstore? And I said, sure. He said, I had to get out of there. He said, I haven't talked to adults in so long. I've just got to get away a little while and get myself back together.
My father, he was in North China for 6 months before he was able to come home. And, you know, a lot of the guys had come home to parades and parties, and there was this outpouring of emotion. Well, when my father came home, it was February of 46. So at that point, a lot of that was over. You know, when he came home, he pulled into the Mobile train station late one night. And it still looked pretty good to him, but it was not a rousing homecoming that probably some guys experienced.
First thing I wanted to eat was a hamburger. And I thought, man, this would be great. And those people in California didn't know how to make a hamburger. And I thought to myself, I should go in there and get that guy and take him with me and let him come to Texas and learn him how to make a hamburger. But anyway, I got my hamburger, but it wasn't what I wanted.
Dr. Sledge had a little Ford coupe that he used for bird hunting, and they told me I was welcome to that, so I got his little car. It smelled like a dog pound, but it had good tires on it, and it was full of gasoline.
When I landed at Prescott, Maine, when that merchant landing here, and the stretcher landed down, you can't move. And anything that you wanted, they gave you. Bananas, milk, oranges, ice cream, cake, candy. I'm laying there. I don't know what I want. I want everything. Ever hear the Andrews sisters? They're singing, bringing rum and Coca-Cola, bing bada bing ba ba ba. And I'm hearing the song laying there. I said, hey, Noise, yeah, can I have rum and Coca? Slightly. They bought my six of them. I threw them all over, rum and Coca-Cola. Yeah. And the Andrews sisters still singing the song. I never forget that. Rum and Coca-Cola, the song.
The March of Time. Back to their homes and families in countless American communities today are coming more and more discharged veterans of the Second World War. After years in which they have existed only as a part of a great military organization, which has clothed them, fed them, and made decisions for them, they must soon begin the process of learning to live on their own and to think and act as civilians once more.
Ernie Pyle wrote for the troops, but he also wrote for the home front. And he has an interesting column in 44. He says they're going to start coming home pretty soon, and they've changed. You got to kind of beware of that. The country doesn't know what to expect from these guys. Who are they? How has combat changed them? They don't know exactly how the country's changed. They know people are employed. They know the country's upbeat. They know we won the war. And yet, how am I going to fit in here? Because you're coming from a world so dramatically different from the one you're re-entering. And there's no decompression chamber. There's no military training. They teach you how to be a soldier, but they don't teach you how to move from soldier to civilian.
There's no easy way out of war when you've been in a lot of combat. The transition was really very difficult, and like all malarkeys, at least this one, I drank a lot, and trying to bury everything out of my mind.
It was very hard for my father. I can remember him telling me that he spent a lot of time just sitting around staring at the wall, trying to just piece it back together and figure out what he was going to do. The transition was made a lot easier by my grandfather.
Gene's father worked with the war wounded in World War I, and so he had such an understanding of what these men had been through, which helped him then so much with his own son.
For a long time there, Eugene would come out at night and talk, and we would talk and talk and talk. I can remember I'd tell him, I'd say, Eugene, put all that out of your mind. There's just nothing else to do. The Marine Corps kind of teaches you to suppress your emotions, and you just do not emotionally dwell on matters. The average Marine does not. And Eugene was not the average Marine. He was emotionally really upset by what he went through. And you can understand it, and you have no criticism of it at all. You just know that that's the way it is.
Today, the problem of the returning veteran is a vital topic for nationwide discussion. Many observers, fearful of war's damaging effect on the personalities of those who fight it, look to the future with misgivings. They fear that if returning veterans find little at home but frustration and lack of understanding, if the American people fail to help them reestablish themselves in the community, their reaction will be prompt.
One of the great fears was that, and this came mostly from academics, there's a lot of fear about the veterans being trained killers. Bill Garnier mentions that, when he had the first veteran reunion for Easy Company, he was turned down by several towns because they thought his guys would wreck the town. They'd have guns and know how to use them.
Word got out this, my God, these men going to have a reunion, Indianapolis, 1946. Pull out the National Guard, they go to the road, they're going to shoot everybody. You're a killer, you kill people, you're going to wind up, you'll kill them again. Nah. Didn't want no part of a gun. The hell with a gun.
And believe it or not, there were actually articles warning that the veterans, because they'd been brainwashed by the Army, where all their individuality was lost. And don't forget, this is a time when everybody knew what a Nazi was, okay, and how a Nazi was created. That after the war, if you had a depression and you had some sort of charismatic, fascistic type of leader that would come forward, a Huey Long from the grave or something like this, he could form these veterans into stormtrooper groups and take over the country that wasn't appreciating them and things like that. This is the kind of wild stuff that appears. One article appeared in Ladies' Home Journal. It said, "Are you going to accept your husband?" Well, the woman who wrote the article said, a better question is, do you want him back? You better take a close look at him because he's been changed by the war. So although there's an explosion in the American marital rate after the war, it almost doubles, the divorce rate triples. It's the highest divorce rate, 1946, in the history of the country. It's never been topped. She's changed and he's changed and the marriage just doesn't work out, particularly if he's living out, some of the trauma of the war. And then entering a strange world, you had to be really apprehensive.
A fine country. Send you off to war, grab the best years of your life, and then the scrap heap.
In the Army, I was a major. Now I'm back selling neckties in the basement.
In the service, us guys are mounted to something. But now, give up your job to go to war. Dodge 88s at the front, and come back to this.
In the summer of 1946, while my father was still working for the Bergen Evening Record in New Jersey, he wrote a series of articles about how difficult it was for the veterans when they were returning home. And it's very interesting to read these articles because he lists town by town what the people were doing to stop affordable housing that was specifically being built to house veterans and to house veterans with their young families. For the most part, do you want to put a bunch of 23, 24-year-old males in apartments in your backyard? And that's what the series of articles discussed, was the difficulties that these veterans had trying to get their lives back together again.
Bill Malden went into the Army, and he got a job with the Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, and he had a talent as an artist. And he did a cartoon series about these two GIs, Willie and Joe, and he continued his cartoon series after the war. And Willie and Joe are often seen sleeping on park benches. And there's one scene where this fat cat is in a railroad car with his plump wife sitting at the table, and a freight train goes by, and there's a guy that looks like what was called in the 30s a hobo. Well, that's a veteran. He really, really hones in directly on these problems, particularly the years 46 to 47, when they were experiencing real problems of homelessness and often despair.
Today, when America's men in uniform look beyond the long years of war, first on their minds is their chance of getting post-war jobs.
I don't have to worry after the war's over. I have the promise of my old job back.
Yeah, but I never had a job. What do I do?
Gonna be tough. About the time that we get out, there'll be millions of people back home all looking for new jobs.
I often say that the way to think about the war is this. For 4 years, the whole world stopped, and nobody did anything that wasn't connected to the war. 90% of American jobs, believe it or not, during World War II were war-related. This whole country was about war. We lived inside a world of war. And that's never happened before. This is what worries the GIs in the foxholes in the last months of the war. They're going to come home and somebody else has their job. Then they find out that Congress has passed a law that an employer cannot deny you your former job if you're able to do it. Now that hurts some guys like Bill Guarnier. His employer at Baldwin Works in Philadelphia could simply say to him, Bill, you've lost a leg in the Battle of the Bulge. I'm sorry to hear that, but we can't bring you back and have you working a heavy industrial job with one leg. And they could get away with that.
Now you can imagine when I went back to work in the machine shop, get lost, kid. Couldn't get a job back. Forget about it. There's no legalities involved there. Out, hit the pike.
Bob Leckie came back and surprised his employer because he threw the language of the bill at him and said, you know, it's against the law. And he got his sports writing job back even though someone had ably replaced him in the job. So that eased things. And then the expected depression doesn't take place. The unemployment rate remains, you know, stunningly low. And there's enough for everybody.
I went to work for the Ford Motor Company on the assembly line in Dallas. It was tough. It was very hard work. I was making $1.28 an hour there. And I quit the Ford plant making $1.28 an hour and went to work for the post office for 84 cents an hour. People thought I was crazy. But who wants to make a career on the assembly line at the Ford plant?
Hauling gravel, putting in tire, dragging the road. I never was out of a job.
I was a salesman, mechanic, any kind of job to make a buck. I can make $1.
Back in 1918, these were pretty exciting pictures. The fighting men of America coming home from France. They planned on picking up their lives just where they'd left them. Only for a lot of them, it didn't work out that way. Not exactly. Some of these marching men wanted to go back to school, but discovered they didn't have the money. Others learned the jobs they'd left behind were gone, or if they were there, they didn't want them. They wanted something better. What about this time, Mac? Are these Navy boys going to get the same sort of deal? No, this time it's going to be different. Because in Washington, there were a group of congressmen with long memories who were in the last war. They knew that when a man gets out of the Army or Navy or Marines, he's worried most about a job, an education, and a home. And that's why Congress passed the law, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights.
They didn't believe it. You know, this is too good to be true, you know? Just like a lot of our veterans that said you didn't believe anything the Army said or the Marines said. They don't really believe it until they see it, until they go down and see how easy it is. And they're all thinking red tape. No red tape. It was so smooth. It was so easy.
It would pay your tuition in college. If you were married, it would give you $125 a month. It enabled boys to barely be able to go to school. I got all the way through med school up to my senior year. I had to finance my senior year.
We got a certain amount of money, $90 a month, I think. Assist in the farming, get started.
I would have never been able to go to law school in my circumstances But because of that GI Bill, I was able to go to law school and get a law degree, which is, a big thing.
Peter Drucker, who's a very famous economic thinker, he argues that 1945, because of the GI Bill, 44-45, is as important in American history in some ways as 1776. He says it created the informational society because we double our college enrollment, housing becomes accessible. With housing and a college education, you're going to go out into an informational kind of world, and you're going to make it happen.
Is D plus 15 on Iwo Jima. Ripon Hill, beyond Hill 362, we're almost beyond the third airport. All of a sudden, I remember I was sitting on a rock. I'm out kind of in the middle of nowhere because I don't see anybody else. And then I realized, if you don't get going, the Japanese are going to shoot you. And I thought, I got to do something about this. And all of a sudden, Sergeant Wendell came out of the rocks. And he came over there and where I was sitting. He said, "Come on, Tatum. Come on with me. You're going to be okay." And so I was suffering from combat fatigue. That's where you don't know what happened to you. Except you're not crazy necessarily. And you're not a coward necessarily, but your mind wouldn't take anymore. How many people can you see killed? 1? 2, 3, 40? Who knows? The mind is different for everybody. I lost more friends, more people, and pretty soon, no matter how strong you are, it'll prey on your mind. You can have guilt feelings about it. How come I'm still here?
After the war, it was clear that the Veterans Administration, the so-called VA, was going to play an enormous role in the transition from war to peace. And in a highly symbolic move, Eisenhower lobbies to have his second-in-command, Omar Bradley, the guy who led the D-Day invasion, he became the head of the VA. And commanding headline statement, he says, "The shooting may be over, but the suffering isn't." And he understood. And Eisenhower understood that these guys have begun the final battle.
That is a common concern among servicemen who have developed nervous conditions during their stay in the Army as to what the public is going to think about them. Undoubtedly, there will be people on the outside who won't have any understanding of the condition, who may think of it as being a rather shameful condition.
Bradley shapes up the VA. He gets rid of the red tape. He gets good doctors. He brings in psychiatrists. A lot of distrust in the military of psychiatry. Some of the guys were told, on their discharge, if you have mental problems, what you want to do is forget about them. If you forget about them, they'll go away. Well, that didn't happen. I see all the cases of post-traumatic stress disorder today. I visit hospitals myself and talk to veterans. And I notice in those hospitals, VA hospitals, that there are still guys in there from World War II. They're 88, 89 years old, and some of them are in there for mental problems. 1.2 million guys were discharged from mental disabilities in World War II. It's a lot of guys. So where have their stories gone? Did this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder, which used to be called shell shock, did it suddenly erupt after Vietnam? I don't think so.
Unfortunately, most of you fellows have gone through some very severe stresses in the Army. Stresses that civilians are rarely subjected to. In civilian life, you can avoid serious stresses. If a civilian, the average civilian, were subjected to similar stresses, he undoubtedly would have developed the same type of nervous condition that most of you fellows developed. All of us have our so-called breaking point.
And I think it has a lot to do with the way we periodize history. There's the war, and then there's the post-war. Eisenhower's a general, and now he's a president. The country is going through difficulty at first, and then we start to win the war, then we win the war, then we move into a period of affluence and prosperity. So the veteran goes from the parade to college, to the GI Bill, and then to Levittown. And then you begin the story of the 50s. And that's how historians write books. They periodize history. They put these arbitrary, fences, the 20s, the 30s. Well, let's not live like that. It's not lived like that. As Omar Bradley said, this is the beginning of a struggle for them. This might be their longest war. The war, they're going to have to, the individual battle they're going to have to fight.
I never talked about the war for 35 years after I was out. I never talked about it to Florence. I never talked about it to my daughters or my parents or brothers or anybody. In fact, the business, I worked 30-something years at the post office, and there was 3 combat veterans worked there, Marines. And all during that 30 years, we never talked about the war. And we might tell something that was funny that happened, but as far as the guts and the gore of it, we never talked about it.
The very first inkling I had was, I guess it would have been in the first year we were married, and we were driving down the street, and a cat or something had been run over and just smashed. And I looked at it and, made some grimace and, ooh, look at that. And he looked at me with this kind of wonder on his face, and he said, "Oh, Shug, I've had best friends who looked worse than that." And that was it. That was the first time I realized that.
I've asked my father a couple times, where were you in the war? And he said, "The war's over, kid, forget about it." That was the answer. You accepted that because that's all you were going to get out of him, or a crutch. If you pushed it any further, you weren't going to get any. That's his way of dealing with. If he didn't want to talk about something, that was his answer.
We were probably in elementary school, and we knew he had a Purple Heart, but we didn't really understand what that was for. And we knew that he had been shot in the rear end and that he had 4 holes from 1 bullet. So that was the extent of our knowledge.
I did not know any of his experiences. My father would always tell me that he won the war, and I always believed him. But I couldn't figure out how he did it if he wasn't in Europe, because the only war that I had ever heard about was the European theater. And the Pacific theater was never really even discussed. So I was somewhat conflicted trying to figure out how he had won the war if he wasn't even in the right place.
I know he thought about it a lot, but he never talked about it. Not through my entire life, except when I typed his books. But he never discussed it. I don't think any of them ever discussed what they went through.
Back in that day, they just didn't go to counseling and seek help when they're not able to sleep and not able to just enjoy life. And he enjoyed his life. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy it. It's just that those days haunted him.
I talked about the war with my wife. She understood everything. She never resisted my talking about my memories. She was unhappy from time to time when I would get very emotional, but you can't help that when you've been through a lot of war. Why, the emotions come with it, whether you like it or not.
Been married to him maybe 6 months. One night, he let out this terrible noise and sat straight up in bed. And I just lay there petrified. And I finally shook him and woke him up. His nightmare was he had fallen into the Pacific when he was hand flying one of those great big 4-engine planes. And he had it for about 10 years off and on. But they all came home with some form of a nightmare.
When he was sleeping, you didn't touch him. If you wanted to wake him, you said his name and he was awake instantly. But you just didn't touch him.
In the house in Mountain Lakes, this big, wonderful house, my bedroom was next to my parents' bedrooms, so I heard the screams. And I think because I heard the screams, I knew that it was the war that was causing the screams, and therefore I never asked what happened to him in the war because I just assumed it was bad. I mean, my father was indestructible, and for something to have happened to him that would cause him to have these horrific nightmares, I didn't want to know about it.
My father was relating to me a story about Lieutenant Brewer, who was brand new with 3rd Platoon, stood up in the middle of a field with the binoculars on, took a bullet through the neck, and Dad asked the medic, and the medic said, he's not gonna make it, he's a goner. And Dad said, got the whole platoon in the middle of the field, I've got to get them out of the field, because he said if they had a machine gun, they'd have mowed us all down. So he left him there. And Bob Brewer ended up working at the CIA, and Dad ends up walking down the halls of the agency one day and runs into this man that he left for dead. And as he told me the story, his lip started quivering, and he ran into the bathroom and threw up. And my dad's not an emotional person. That's the most visceral of any emotion I've ever seen out of him. It was, yeah, thinking about leaving his buddy.
When I was probably 5 years old, the movie Patton had come out. We were in the living room, and it was just this constant artillery barrage, large caliber gunfire. And I can remember my dad getting more agitated, and then he got up and went into the kitchen and just started pounding on the refrigerator. Well, of course, my mother knew what was going on, so she talked to him and calmed him down. But what it was, that was his emotional reaction. I mean, he had said that at Peleliu and Okinawa, when they were under heavy artillery fire, they would be in their foxholes and would just beat their fists on the ground in sheer frustration and helplessness. You know, he had always said that the most helpless thing in the world was to be under heavy artillery fire.
I do remember that, and it was emotional at the time. It's emotional now. And that impressed on me at a very young age what a horrible thing war was, and what a difficult experience it was to recover from.
Gore Vidal said that he expected that all these great writers were going to come out of the war and write about their experiences. But a lot of writers didn't confront the war directly. Instead, we got what Paul Fussell calls the great silence, Fussell the literary critic, where Fussell is surprised by the absence of literature in the 40s about the war. The great exception, of course, is Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead. It's brutal confrontation with the awfulness of war, and it's cold-eyed look at it, and that was a bestseller. But it took lots of writers who were in the war a long time to write about the experience.
My father said after the 3rd day on Peleliu, it suddenly occurred to me, I've never read anything about what it's really like. So he was determined that he was going to essentially amplify the historical record, if you will, based on his experiences.
With the Old Breed was published in 1981, and it was supposed to be just for the family. It was supposed to be so that my brother and I would have some idea of what he had been through. Not only that, but something of a catharsis for him to purge his memory, to divest himself of these horrible experiences.
It is touted, and it is, I think, the Red Badge courage of World War II because of its honesty and because he doesn't get in the way of the story. and because of his humility. And he said, what we went through is unforgettable, shouldn't be forgotten. And I think a lot of his feelings about the war have to do with that he didn't feel that people understood what men like him went through.
There was just this sense that the book was having an impact and that it was getting out there. And we would get a lot of letters from family members. And they always invariably said, thank you. You told my father's story. There was this sense that he had really, it was the everyman combat soldiers, Marines experience. And there was just this incredible sense of gratitude from veterans and their families that at last the truth was out there.
I started going to the 1st Marine Division reunions in 1980, and there was 20 K Company men at that reunion. We'd sit around and talk, and they'd say, Bergen, you remember so-and-so and so? I said, no, I don't remember that. And he said, well, hell, you ought to, you were there. You know, what's wrong with you, you stupid? And then they'd start telling what happened, how it happened, and who was involved in it, and it would come back to me like it happened yesterday. And I think going to those reunions is what straightened me out. I think everybody should go to the reunions and talk to their buddies and kind of get it out in the open, and I think it's good for them.
I went to New York reunion. Went here for the war, 47. When I got there, I got the men from E Company. I think it was maybe about 7 or 8, maybe 10 from E Company there. So we got together. Good. Next year, you come with another one. He comes with another one. I'll bring another one. Instead of 10, we'll have 20. So next year, we had maybe 15. 18. As the years progressed from 47 on, 20, 30, 40, 50. I think up in San Diego, 81 men came. There were 81. It would just kept progressing, bigger and bigger and bigger. Each company got together every year from then till now.
He was discharged, I think, on December 22nd or 23rd, and then he wrapped up his discharge papers in Christmas papers and gave them to my mom as a Christmas gift, meaning the greatest gift of all is he was finally released from the war and able to start his life with her.
When I married Franny, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I got beautiful memories, that's all. Memories will never leave you. Never leave you.
2 days. She came in on the 27th, we were married on the 29th. We've been married 64 years now.
I had girlfriend Shirley during the war when I was in Australia. And my wife burned all of my pictures that I had of Shirley shortly after we were married. But years later, my wife Mary called me. I was at the office and she said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, sit down." She said, "Guess who's here?" And I said, "Eleanor Roosevelt." And she said, "No, Shirley." And I said, "Shirley who?" And she said, "Shirley, you know who. She's here." And she has her family with her. And Mary wouldn't let them leave. Mary kept them day after day after day after day after day in this little small house that we lived in. She said, "I wanted to be sure you got enough of Shirley." But then, maybe 10 years later, Shirley's oldest child came through Mobile, and he looked us up, and he and my daughter Mary fell in love and got married. So my daughter is married to my old girlfriend's son from Australia. People think, well, you know, you're so damn good looking, you know, that you must have had a gang of women. I never had a bunch of women. I had one, and that's the only one I wanted. And even though she predeceased me, as far as I'm concerned, I'm still married to Irene, and that's the way I'll die.
Nobody ever heard of New Britain, Cape Arthur, New Britain. They never even knew a battle fought there. 90% of the people in the United States never knew a battle existed there. In Peleliu, the same way. After I started going to the reunions, that's about the time in my life that I decided that the stories of the battles should be told, they should be written, and they should not be forgotten.
To a certain extent, my father's writing was the most important thing in his life. I really think his writing kept him centered, kept him focused. And therefore, there was always a distance between my father and at least me. I don't know if my brothers would say the same thing, but there was a distance that was broken when I read Helmet, because he lets you in. He lets you in much, much farther than we were ever allowed in when we were children. The first time I read Helmet from my pillow, I cried most of the way through it. And I cried most of the way through it because I hadn't read it. And now, by the time I read it, he was gone. And now I couldn't, there was nothing I could say. I couldn't say, now I understand the nightmares. Now I understand a lot of things. So I cried most of the way through it.
He always remembered the day that they landed on Peleliu, the day they landed at Okinawa, but he wouldn't say anything to me about it. But it would be a very hard day for him. And I remember the last time he went to church, it was Easter Sunday. And we sat there, and for some reason, it had nothing to do with the service, but the tears rolled down his face all through the service. And he never went back to church. The Easter Sunday is when they landed on Okinawa.
These experiences are universal. They go back to Homer, to the Iliad, which is about warfare and its costs and comradeship, to the Odyssey, which is about returning. And World War I veterans experienced it, Civil War veterans experienced it, etc. You know, it's just the world within war that you enter when you get into, especially total conflicts. It's a transforming experience. It's a warning to history, really. I mean, most of these guys will tell you they don't want another one.
We were brought up to think that there was no country like our country, and it was our duty to take care of it for the next generation. And then along came this wall that threw us into the middle of it. And as the boys say over and over, we just did our duty. It was what we were supposed to do, and we did it. And they still, as old men, feel that way, but they felt that way as young men.
By looking at these guys, by shedding light on a darkened period of American history, I think what we're accomplishing is we're humanizing these guys. They have been stick figures that were heroes in warfare and made the easy transition home. It's never that easy. These guys experienced a medley of problems, but dealt with them heroically and directly. Now, not every guy turned out great, and not every problem was solved. But my God, when you look at this whole situation and the kind of country that they created, the families, stable families they created, they made it happen.